record this for the folks that aren't here. Let's talk about food. So it's got a great title, but it's not the happiest of talks. Because the reality when you're discussing food, it's not about fun stuff. It's usually about thinking about food scarcity and what causes food scarcity and how we think about food and health and how we think about how sustainability factors into food production and climate change into food production. So it really wraps in a lot of not so fun topics, but definitely an important topic. Now, I'm not a big fan of Venn diagrams, not by any stretch of the imagination. I don't like them at all, actually. But I do like this Venn diagram because it's a nice eight-pronged Venn diagram. So it's like a monster Venn diagram that really gets at all the topics we're going to be discussing today. And so we're going to be discussing food production a lot, but we're going to talk about how food production really fits into the environment, public health, diet, disruption of the climate, equity or the lack of equity, depletion of resources, i.e., like tragedy of the commons, and population growth. So we're going to be hitting all 8 points today, and so I'm sure you could tell that many of these topics are not the most pleasant in the world to discuss, but we got to do what we got to do. So we're going to start off with this idea from James Grant. He's a scientist. And so in 1994, he came up with the idea of what we call the vicious spiral of poverty, population growth, and environmental degradation, or the PPE spiral. And when I was writing these slides the other day, or a couple weeks ago, I wrote PPE, and I can't think of PPE as anything but personal protective equipment anymore because of COVID. I know, like it was coined earlier than PPE for COVID, but that's all I can think about, which is kind of bad. But the idea being here, what Grant was getting at is that there's this linkage between poverty, population growth, and the environment. And we've already discussed this, right? How do you sustainably grow a population, right? And part of growing a population, as we discussed, is looking at how do you feed that population and can you do it sustainably without degrading the environment. And so we're really trying to get at this idea because they are related. As you change the lack of equality of food or increase poverty, you're changing population growth dynamics, you're changing how the environment is. So they all go up or down really with one another. As poverty goes down, as does population growth, as does environmental degradation, right? So you have to this lecture really captures a lot of different things. So I want to set the stage for sort of thinking about food and food production and the effects food production has on the planet. And so these are the 2015 UN Millennium Goals. I couldn't find the updated version of this. So the 2015 was the newest one I could find. But we've talked about these Millennium Goals before, and so if you want to read those, they're here in this link below. It's a beefy read. But what we're looking at here is the proportion of people living on less than $1.25 a day in 1990, 2011, and then 2015. So $1.25 a day. Now, think about what that would mean on a monthly term, right? That's basically $40 a month. Now, I'm sure you guys all know that even if you made minimum wage here in the United States, you couldn't essentially live at all, but you couldn't even afford a one-bedroom apartment in any city across in this country. So $1.25 a day is severe poverty. Really, it's severe poverty. Clearly not something that's sustainable here, but other countries where the cost of living is cheaper, it is sort of. And so the trends you're seeing here is the 90s are in the light colors, 2011 is in the medium shade of colors, and 2015 is in the darker colors. And you notice that all of them, they go down, right? So sub-Saharan Africa, we go from 57% down to 41%. And we're seeing a decline across the globe, which is good, right? Poverty is going down. Now, that's a good thing. But globally speaking, I think the numbers speak for themselves, right? 10% of a population of 7.5 billion is 750 million people living on $1.25 a day. That's a lot of people, right? I mean, that's twice the population of the United States. So that's a lot of people. So clearly, wealth inequality is still a problem. It is, right? We're not. It's not something that has been fixed. It's not something that's going to be fixed for potentially ever. But wealth inequality is clearly a problem, and the severe wealth inequality is still a huge and rampant problem. Um, and when we sort of look at, I should just make one mention. Some of the places that are hit heaviest by this: sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, a little bit of Latin America, but a lot of inequality in developing regions as a whole. Um, and so, especially when you exclude China from the equation. So, lots of poverty in areas that are developing. And we can look at population growth um, over time. So, 1950s projected it to 2100, Asia, Africa, Europe, and so on and so forth. You notice that everything besides Asia and Africa, population growth is pretty stymied, right? We're talking about, I mean, sizable populations, right? Half a billion people is still a sizable group of individuals, but population growth is not nearly as fast as it is in Asia, nor is it in Africa. And so current projections put Asia hitting a maximum population about 5.5 billion people. Uh, by 2100, we expect those numbers to be down by about 4.7 billion, with um, Africa having the most rapid growth after 20 in the 2020s, and after hitting at about 4.3 billion people. So a lot of population growth, lots of wealth inequality. Now you can imagine that wealth inequality in a country that has the population that's exploding is either going to get really bad, as happens quite often, or it's going to improve or stay the same, right? But the reality is it's probably either going to stay the same or get worse, right? As populations tend to grow, typically what we see. So we can just put this in a much easier to understand term from the United Nations: billions of people, less developed regions, more developed regions. More developed regions, very slow population growth; less developed regions, pretty high population growth. So we're seeing lots of population growth in places where money is clearly already a problem, and where money is a problem, food in turn becomes a problem. So that's the sort of setting the stage, right? There's this pretty large amount of wealth inequality. There's lots of uh, a lot of this wealth inequality is occurring in heavily developing areas. So where does food come in? Well, as I mentioned, where money is a problem, food becomes a problem. So according to the FAO, or the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, they estimate globally that 10%, I'm sorry, 9% of the population are severely malnourished. And what does that mean? Well, basically you're subsisting on less than 500 calories a day, and you're lacking in one or more uh, essential nutrients. So you're lacking in zinc, or you're lacking in iron, right? Something that is absolutely essential. That's 10% of the population. So you're talking 700 million people. And on top of that 10%, 25% are moderately or severely food insecure. And again, that's a caloric value between 500 and 1,000 calories on an average daily basis, with a potential deficiency in a vitamin or any other nutrient. So you're talking, three, what, 2.1 billion people or so currently that are experiencing some sort of nutritional stress. And that's a lot, right? 30% of the population experiencing nutritional stress is a lot. But that, to put that in perspective, if we're thinking about 2 billion or so people with malnutrition, there's about 2 billion people that are overweight or and obese currently. And so that's kind of an odd dichotomy, right? 2 billion people have way too much food, and 2 billion people have almost not enough food to even live. So that's a weird dichotomy, right? I, this one always gets me. Um, and so we have this weird dichotomy: too much food some places and too little food other places. And so this leads us to thinking about, okay, well, how does that break down with population growth going forward? And the question we're going to ask is, how do we feed people, right? What is the ecology behind that? What is the economics behind that? How do we feed people? So we know we're projected to hit between 8.5 and 9 billion folks by 20 2050 or so, which is about plus ish a billion people from where we are now. So, how do we feed people? And to feed people, we have to consider the major sort of defining factors for food production. And this boils down to three words: water, soil, and our best friend, biodiversity. That was technically five words because I threw in best friend, but three words: water, soil, biodiversity. And the biodiversity we're going to talk about today is not just wild biodiversity as we've been sort of putting it in context. We're going to discuss domesticated biodiversity as well. That's an important factor. Not something you might think is a meaningful thing, but it is. So let's start off with water. So let's look at water scarcity. This is global map, obviously. The blue is the little no water scarcity. Uh, Orange is a physical water scarcity, i.e., you know, your aquifers are starting to run dry or very low. Uh, Peachy color, as you see here in like Mexico, approaching water scarcity. Purple is economic water scarcity, and then um, not estimated is in gray. And so when we think about an economic water scarcity, it's something that like puts a the water is so scarce it puts a direct impact on the economic functioning of that country. And so that's our map, and it's thankfully mostly blue right now. But there's a whole continent that is basically majority of it is economically water scarce, and I'm sure you guys know from watching any documentary that water is a huge problem in Africa. It always has been, and it likely always will be, in particular with climate change. But you can also notice that there's this area here of Southeast Asia that is pretty heavily densely populated that is also pretty economically water scarce. And there are a lot of people live there, right? A lot of people currently, and a lot of people going forward are going to experience water scarcity. Now, you can imagine if Africa is expected to grow its population to 4 billion people, no one lives in the Sahara pretty much because it's just a giant pile of sand. So most people live here and along the coast and down in South Africa. But you can imagine if most people live in this purple area, it's going to be a real difficult struggle to grow food when water scarcity is already a issue. So that's sort of what we're facing, right? Areas that are expected to grow in population size, they are experiencing water scarcities, and that's going to impact their capacity to produce food and sustain that population. So that's water. Now, this graph is a little bit misleading in the sense that we are experiencing global droughts like we've never seen before. Um, I'll just make mention of that because, I'm sure you guys have heard of the droughts out in California and Oregon that are causing those monster wildfires. There's droughts in Central and South America. There's droughts across Europe. There's droughts everywhere. So this doesn't capture like drought. It captures like how much water these individual places can extract. Um, but drought is definitely a big issue. Um, and so water is one thing, right? Having enough water, but water, uh, as you guys are, learning with that microplastics lab, water isn't always clean, right? And water needs to be clean for it to be drinking or drank, I should say, by humans and livestock. It also needs to be clean if you're going to water your crops with it, because anything you water your crops with, your crops are going to pick up. And if your crops pick it up, well, that means you are going to eat it. So we can look at the emissions of organic water pollutants across the planet. Light colors are very little organic water pollutants, so Greenland leading the way, because there's like 8 people on Greenland. And then darker colors are a million plus. We're looking at kilograms per day. And so you can see the United States and China lead the way. This is another example where China and the United States are 1 and 2 in a bad thing, right? Climate change, we're 1 and 2 in a bad way. But you can see that pretty much everywhere across the globe, there's organic water pollutants making it into water. So even though there might not be water scarcity, say in France, well, if they have polluted water, that's not going to be water that's worthwhile to use, not for agriculture, not for raising livestock, and certainly not for human consumption. So you can have water, but the water can be tainted. And then the other way we can look at pollution to water is actually by just looking at what we call oceanic dead zones. And so oceanic dead zones are a specialty of mine. When I was a grad student, I worked on this problem um, from the perspective of microorganisms. because when we're looking at oceanic dead zone, it's really a combination of pollutants meeting the ocean and then the microorganisms responding. So the way a oceanic dead zone, and you might have heard of like the dead zone at the end of the Mississippi River Delta, what ends up happening is as we fertilize our crops, that fertilizer has to go somewhere. And the most common place it goes is into our rivers and lakes, and everything eventually drains into the ocean. So all this fertilizer is making it into the ocean. Now, when that fertilizer makes it to the ocean, it stimulates plankton to go crazy, right? All these photosynthetic organisms, they go crazy. And they go crazy until they exhaust all those nutrients, i.e., till the growing season is over. Once the growing season is over, they run out of nutrients and they all start to die. And once they start to die, the microbes. Sorry about that noise in the background. My dog dropped his bone on the ground and he scared himself. Sorry. Um, Once those organisms die, the microbes present start to eat them. And as those microbes start to eat all those dead plankton, well, they consume all the oxygen in the water, leading to oceanic dead zones. So areas of the ocean that have little to no oxygen. And so we use oceanic dead zones as a proxy to understand pollution from agricultural systems. And you can see that some places are pretty heavily polluted. The entire eastern seaboard and the entire Gulf of Mexico for us, and large parts of California and Oregon and Washington, lots of dead zones, and including dead zones in um, Black Sea and other parts of Europe. So we can taint our water in other ways, right? Not just through, pesticide pollutants, but it could also be fertilizers. We can also pollute it with pesticides because when you typically apply fertilizers, you also typically apply pesticides. So water again can be tainted in any number of ways, removing it from the usable pool. Now that's water. Next up is soil, and soil is a resource, and it's not something people typically think as a resource, but it really is. We owe everything of our civilization to about the top 8 inches of of topsoil, and I say that not like like ironically or anything. Like we really do. The only reason we can support 7 billion people is because of the topsoil, right? The only reason we can grow food is because of good soil. And so this map, as you can tell, kind of looks like it's on fire. And what we're looking at is data from ISRIC, which is the International Soil Reference and Information Center. And we're looking at red as being very degraded soil, orange is as degraded soil. Um, See in the Arctic where there's no like agriculture really, we have stable soils, and then there's places without vegetation, i.e., like deserts. Right, you can see the Sahara, the Chihuahuan Desert here, the Gobi Desert. Australia is just big one giant desert basically. um, but that's what we have, and what you'll notice is that um, the map is on fire, right? It's mostly orange with a lot of red, right? And this is true not just in the United States, where we're more advanced economically, in Europe or someplace like China, but it's also true in sub-Saharan Africa. And so, where humans grow their food, we're rapidly degrading the quality of our soils, and that's not good. Because, as I said, we owe everything to the quality of our soils. And if soils are depleted, well, we're not going to be able to grow meaningful amounts of food on them. So not a great picture for soil quality. And this is just another map showing pretty much the exact same thing, looking at soil fertility. It's an old school map. I like this map because it's got the dots and the horizontal lines. That reminds me of when I was in like elementary school. But again, showing how soil fertility does vary over space on the globe. And I just want to highlight sort of what we're doing. And so we're going to look at this uh, idea of degradation of our soil as a resource by looking at our friends in Iowa. And so Iowa is a heavily, heavily agricultural area, big on soybeans, pretty big on corn, big on other things too. But soybeans are kind of their big export here. And so you can see not a lot of agriculture and soil erosion in the center, but lots of soil erosion in the east, and the west of this figure. And that's where most of the agriculture occurs in Iowa, east on the east and the west. And so you can see Iowa is just eroding soil. And I guess the question you should ask is how is Iowa eroding soil? Well, it's the same way every place else is eroding soil. The way we farm currently is we till our soils. We just turn it up, right? We mix it up, right? And that's supposed to help improve, um, the yield of crops. But the reality is, when we do that, we cause soil to be eroded, and we lose soil to heavy rains and things like that. So, just our agricultural practices promote, and sometimes pretty heavily, the loss of this soil, and it's a very valuable resource. And you can actually physically Excel graph where you're looking at tons of topsoil loss per acre, and we're looking at greater than 5, greater than 10, and so on and so forth. Just as a note, less than 5 tons of soil loss per acre um, is like a sustainable rate. Um, and this is a cumulative rate, just not it's not a yearly rate, it's a cumulative rate thus far. So less than 5 tons per acre is a sustainable and natural. So most of Iowa's soil is being eroded at a unsustainable rate. And again, it's all due to the way we practice agriculture. And we'll get into that idea of how agriculture actually physically works in I don't know, like 10 slides or so. And so that's soil, right? Our practices of agriculture are depleting this resource, but it's clearly necessary, very much like water, to grow food. And then the final one, and this is one we've talked about quite a bit, and this is biodiversity and how biodiversity influences the world. Now, we've talked about biodiversity in in terms of ecosystem functions, and that's cool, right? It provides all four ecosystem categories that we've talked about. But biodiversity also influences agricultural output. Higher biodiversity means better ecosystems, more services means more food. So biodiverse areas produce more food. It's just the way it is. And you can see through time, we're losing species, right? We're impacting it from 1700 to about 2000, and it's projected into 2050, right? So we're losing biodiversity quite a bit. And with biodiversity, remember, comes the loss of those four ecosystem services and the $120 trillion economic boon it provides for our planet. So those are the key parts for growing food, sort of those three keys, you could call them services. But clearly we're not taking sustainably, right? If we were taking sustainably, we wouldn't be talking about this class, right? So we're going to talk about the ecological footprint again. And so we discussed like the ecological footprint when we were talking about biodiversity, but the ecological footprint, and it's a group of scientists. They estimate that 3 planets would be needed now if every citizen were to adopt the United Kingdom's lifestyle. And what does that mean? Well, you would need 3 planets worth of resources to support 7 billion people living like they do in the UK. However, if we all adopted the United States lifestyle, we would need 5 planets worth of resources. So clearly not a sustainable thing, right? Earth is only one planet, right? It can only really provide so much resources. Um, and so we can actually look at this over time. So we've looked at a similar graph to this. This is the number of Earths from 1970 all the way up until modern times. We can see that by 2010 we required 1.5 Earths of resources to basically do our thing. Um, Business as usual, not changing any of our habits. We're expected to need 2.5 or so Earths. If we have a rapid reduction in things, we expect to drop down to be using 1 Earth. But this scenario in red is clearly far more likely. People don't like to change how they behave. So clearly, taking these resources far too much to the extreme, right? Taking too much soil, taking too much water, and you can look at this, at a global level and within each region. So, you can look at things that are in the warmer colors, where the ecological footprint is exceeding the capacity or the biocapacity or the resources of a given area. You can see that in the United States, Mexico, Northern Africa, Europe, China. And then you can see the biocapacity exceeding the ecological footprint, so they're not taking as much. You can see that, I'm sorry, they're not taking as much relative to what resources are present. And so you can see that in Australia and the islands, Russia, large parts of Africa, most of South America. And so I think this is a nice look at, while we're taking a lot from the planet, like too much, it's not everyone doing it equally, right? We've talked about the United States being kind of a jerk in terms of how much we take. but it's clearly not just us that is taking too much. You're seeing it the same in China, in the Middle East, in Europe as well. So we're clearly taking too much, but it's not equal, right? We're not all equally producing the same amount of CO2. We're not all equally consuming the same amount of food, right? We're not all equally producing the same amount of plastics, right? So there is a disparity here, and the disparity is typically between nations that are doing really well economically and nations that aren't doing very well economically. So, all right. So what I would recommend you do. So this is the food quiz that I mentioned on the syllabus in the beginning class. This is a kind of a little fun website, depending on how you find how much you enjoy being told you're not a environmentally conscious person. But if you have like, it's like, I think it's 5 minutes to do it. Head over to this footprintcalculator.org and calculate your own footprint. So, calculating this sort of thing for yourself to see how you're doing. So definitely take a peek at this. It's a great way to, when you pair it with your waste production lab, to see, how you're doing. It always guilts me into being a better person, but um, definitely something you should take a peek at if you haven't done any of these things at the moment. So that's food. That's food. So that's part of the story, though, right? Because remember, when I showed you that massive Venn diagram, there was 8 things. So we're going to talk about those 8 things because when we're thinking about food, we're thinking about food production, we're thinking about sustainability, all these things in one way, shape, or form do tie into human health and they do tie into public health. So we're going to talk about food, too much food, and how that ties into health of individuals. So we're first going to start talking about what happens when there's too much food. So healthcare systems currently uh, in low and middle income countries, as well as highly developed countries, i.e., the United States, are overwhelmed by the rise of non-communicable diseases, things like diabetes, heart disease, right? Things that I can't pass on to you, right? It's not like a virus, right? I can't give you heart disease. I mean, I guess if I like force fed you donuts for 10 years straight, I could probably give you heart disease, but it's not like I'm passing on a virus. That's a that'd be a hell of a thing to do. Be force fed donuts for 10 years. Ugh. Um, and so we can start to look at the health effects of too much food. So globally, obesity we know has doubled since the 80s. We know that obesity is expected to double again within the next 10 to 15 years. So obesity is clearly becoming a problem, right? Too much food. More is coming into your mouth than is coming out the back end. And so when we start to look at this, there's all sorts of things associated with eating too much food or too much of the wrong food, diabetes, heart disease. And so we know that diabetes is increasing pretty dramatically. And at a global sort of level, 80% of those with diabetes live in developing countries. And of the global cases of diabetes, 90% is type 2. And so type 2, as I'm sure you guys may or may not know, is the one you acquire, right? It's not the natural insulin resistance that you could potentially be born with type 1. But we can look at the cases globally. So 85, 30 million, 15 years later, sorry, 25 years later, we're up to 285 million. And then we project in 10 years, we'll be well over 350 million cases globally. So that's a lot. Now, along with diabetes, it's not just like, oh, I have to take insulin, right? There's the cost of insulin, which is, especially here in the United States, is absurdly expensive. Um, not so much otherwise, but definitely very expensive here in the United States. So there's that. There's the effects of healthcare costs for diabetics. They're prone to getting any number of healthcare issues. And then there's, what happens if you can't afford your insulin, right? If you live in a place that's poor, or if you live in a place like the United States that doesn't have a socialized form of medicine, right? That puts a whole huge burden on the medical system as a whole. And so the other thing that is directly tied into too much food is this idea of heart disease and stroke and many, many, many types of cancer. So there is negative health side effects to eating too much food, right? I mean, I don't think I need to tell you guys that, but I figured I'd hit you with some numbers because that's a lot of people with diabetes, especially type 2. And the weird thing about eating too much food is that it typically coexists alongside not eating enough food. And so I always find these graphs to be really weird, but we're looking at arbitrary countries here on the y-axis. Um, to the left of the red line, it's underweight. To the right of the line, it's overweight, and it's just a percentage of the population. And you can see that even places that have severely high amounts of malnourished people, there's still people that are overweight, right? And so they can exist side by side, right? It's not like the you have to have one or the other. They can exist side by side, and sometimes dramatically so, right? Whatever country this is, I don't know. It's not labeled, so. But the opposite of too much food clearly is not enough food. So we're looking at the hunger map from the World Food Program. I think they just won a Nobel Prize, if I'm not mistaken, for all their work trying to help hungry people. We have category 1 through 5. Category 1 is the best, where less than 5% of your population is malnourished. Red, or 5, is the worst, where greater than 35% of your population is malnourished. And most of the planet is blue, right? Most of the northern hemisphere is blue. Parts of South America are blue. Australia is blue. But then there's this monster area of Africa and parts of South America and Central America as well too. And then this pretty sizable region here in China and India, where a large proportion of the people are just malnourished. And I think there's a really interesting kind of parallel to draw here, right? You kind of would expect it in Africa, right? Because when you're thinking about Africa, right, places that have lots of soil degradation, lots of water issues, and lots of economic problems, right? And there's also civil and social problems too, but we're thinking just about the biology ones here, not so much the social issues. Um, and it seems kind of odd that you would think, oh, China has such a high proportion, right? Upwards of 20% in China. And you think, well, China has the second largest GDP on the planet, right? Just behind the United States. So there is this relationship again between economic stress and hunger, but there's sometimes just like a systematic issue in a country, right? And I think that is easily represented by a country like China, where huge population, huge GDP, still lots and lots of hungry people. But clearly, lots of the planet is still very hungry. Remember, most of the planet lives in this area and this area, right? There's only what I think 500 million people on this side of the planet, and the rest of them live pretty much right here. So, lots of hungry people, lots and lots of hungry people. So we have this dichotomy, right? Too much food, too little food. So who consumes the world's food? And the reality is, it's actually not overly surprising, right? We lead the way. So we're looking at is grain consumption per capita per year. So how much each person eats in terms of grain per year. This is in kilograms, but 1 kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. So you basically multiply all these numbers by 2 and you get the poundage. So the average person in the United States, this is just the average person, consumes 1,600 pounds of grain per year. Now, that's a lot, right? If you break that down, that ends up being 5 or so pounds of grain a day. And you might say to yourself, Dr. Kearns, I don't eat 5 pounds of grain a day. I don't know anyone that eats 5 pounds of grain a day, right? No one eats 5 pounds of grain a day. That's a lot of grain. However, you do eat meat, you do eat chicken, you do eat pork, and those are fed grain. So we consume the most. Italy consumes a lot too, those pesky Italians. Um, but even large countries like China, India still consume a lot of grain per year. But again, what's driving the numbers here in the United States very, very high is meat-based diets. So when I say the United States, the average person eats, 1,600 pounds of grain a year. Most of that is actually coming from beef, from pork, from poultry. So it takes about 700 kilograms of grain to produce 100 kilograms of beef. And then, this is the amount for pork and this is the amount for poultry. So that's a lot of grain to produce. Again, not a lot of food, right? 200 pounds of food, you need 1,400 pounds of grain. That's a lot of food to produce not a lot of food, right? That return on food investment is not that high. I mean, the economics of it is high, but in terms of like a 1-to-1 ratio, not very great, right? And then I guess the other striking thing that always gets me is for every kilogram of grain that you produce, it takes 1,000 kilograms of water. So to produce 100 kilograms of beef, you need to feed, you need 700,000 kilograms of water. So 1.4 million pounds of water. That's like an Olympic-sized swimming pool's worth of water to produce enough grain to produce 200 pounds of beef. Now, I'm sure you guys know beef cows weigh hundreds, I'm sorry, they weigh 1,000 plus pounds, right? So to produce one cow, you're talking millions of gallons of water here. It's a striking amount of water. And clearly, water, as we've discussed, is a really important resource here. And so that's the cost, right? This is striking, but the cost really down to eating a lot of, flesh, right? Animals. And so we do know that when we start to look at global meat consumption at the global scale, United States per capita meat consumptions have increased by 70% from 141 pounds to 223 pounds per year since 1961. So it's a lot of meat. Um, so you're talking about like 220 pounds. That means most people are eating around, 0.75 pounds of beef a day, or poultry or pork. That's a lot of meat. And then you know that there's people that are vegetarians. So that means there's people that are super meat eaters, right? They eat multiple pounds of meat every day, which is, I can only imagine it's not so fun for their digestive system, but that those people exist. Um, so that's what we're seeing in the United States, and global demand for meat will double from the 1990s to 2020, which is not surprising at all. And so you can see this table. We don't have the numbers for 2020 yet, so these are projected meat consumption for 2020, but they seem to be pretty accurate. So you can see the world is growing, essentially doubling from 1983 to 2020. So clearly, from a food production standpoint, that's a lot of grain you're going to need to produce that much meat, right? So again, becoming a big problem. And if you want to if you want to look at the most Texan graph ever, we can visualize pounds per capita of beef with actually pictures of beef. And I don't know if this is actually accurate, but I just really like this thing. When I was searching Google, a couple weeks ago to find these pictures, I saw this one and I was like, "Yep, I got to include this," because again, this screams Texas. Putting your bars in your bar chart as pieces of meat. So definitely Texas. Um, so we have lots of meat, but again, we have this dichotomy between too much food and not enough food in this planet. So what does the World Health Organization recommend? Well, clearly achieving an energy balance, right? Not overeating, eliminating trans fatty acids, total fats, shifting towards unsaturated fats you typically get in plants, uh, eating more fruits, veggies, legumes, right? Stuff you guys already know. Right? You guys know this stuff. Um, Now, that's the World Health Organization's global guidelines. Now, when you look at the USDA's guidelines for Americans, ours is a little bit less nice. Ours is basically balancing calories with physical activity. That's sort of one of the issues in the United States. We eat too much for how little we do. And that's, that I don't want to poke fun at Americans because there's lots of people who are just, they're always at work. And so, like, you can't really fault them for not being active. But definitely, we eat more than we can exercise off. And what we do eat is simply just too much things that are bad, right? High fats, high salt, things like that. So, um, you know, sort of pushing down our obesity levels is again a dietary thing, and it varies depending on what country you're in. But in the United States, where it's kind of a big problem, I think we're number 2 or 3 in the world in terms of obesity. Um, you know, Definitely something that has to be tampered down if we're thinking about food production. But as with climate change, we have um, this really interesting phenomenon with food, and we have what's called intergenerational food equity. Now, our agricultural systems were set up after World War II, and we'll get into that in a second. But what it has led to, so what it started with, baby boomers and their parents, and then into Gen X, and has persisted to modern times, is this industrialization of food production. Taking food, injecting 1,000 cc's of capitalism into it, and maximizing food production for profit. expansion, I guess would be the word I was trying to say there. Right? Maximizing how much food you can produce, investing the least amount to produce that food, and getting the most economic benefits from it. And that's what we're thinking about with industrialized food production. And you guys probably have a pretty good sense of what this is already, but it has some pretty significant um, effects, right? It puts a huge burden on land and water resources, including disruption of soils and nutrient cycles, changes in land and soil degradation, changes in water use. We're seeing drug resistance to antibiotics, depletion of stocks, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and the big one, which ties not just food production but also general, effects of capitalism poking things, which is our friend climate change, so climate disruption. So, but again, this is an intergenerational thing, right? This is something that was started after World War II, and it has just persisted, right? So, and the worst effects of it are definitely not behind us. I mean, there's definitely going to be this. The system is definitely going to continue going forward, unless something huge happens. But a lot of the effects have already come sort of to fruition, as you saw with how degraded our soils are and how stressed we are for water. So, definitely, again, like climate change, where it was something that was set up by the generations before us, and now our generations are kind of paying the price for it, and we're going to pay the price for it going forward. But food industrialization, as I mentioned, it's a system of agriculture based on the principles of the Industrial Revolution, right? Mechanization, efficiency, speed, uniformity, and standardization. And what this means for agriculture is monocropping, growing only one type of food in a field, heavy use of fertilizers, pesticides, water, and a heavy reliance on fossil fuels. And so when we look to the Union of Concerned Scientists, it's actually a pretty cool. Well, I say it's cool, but I'm a nerd, so I think scientists are cool. It's actually a pretty good group of scientists that they try to tackle lots of science misinformation, and they define industrial agriculture as viewing the farm as a factory with inputs such as pesticides, feed, fertilizer, and fuels, and outputs corn, chicken, and so forth. And the goal is to increase yield, such as bushels per acre, and decrease the cost of production, usually by exploiting economies of scale. So doing what we did with the Industrial Revolution, right? Doing like thinking about like how Henry Ford set up the Model T factories, right? Maximizing efficiency and operating on a larger scale. Because if you could do things efficient and sell a lot of it, you can make the most amount of money. So that's what we're going for here, right? And that's what our food system looks like. And there's not a lot of small farms left, right? So most of the farms you guys get your food from, unless you actively seek to get it from a local farm, is from an industrialized food source. So, but what led to this to come to be? Well, it really started with after World War II. So some German guys named uh, Haber and Bosch, they developed an industrialized process to produce fertilizer. So before World War II, our fertilizers were small batches and typically relied on animal products. Come World War II, our friends Haber and Bosch, uh, accidentally, because they were trying to create bombs, funny enough, it's kind of, I guess it's not too atypical of a German during World War II. Um, but they created the industrialized capacity to produce fertilizer, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And so after that, once we had this industrialized way to make fertilizer, things kind of just took off in food industrialization. And so the things we're seeing is heavy use of fertilizers. We're seeing high resource use, soil, water, energy, and then obviously the environmental consequences here. Water degradation, pollution, degradation of water sources, loss of soil quality, and it's creates this sort of system, and it feeds into the system of artificially inexpensive fuel and water. And so we have lots of subsidies out there at the federal level and the state level that subsidize water and fuel that make this possible. So like the farm bill or the fossil fuel subsidies we give to artificially drive down the cost, which makes food industrialization actually possible. um, and I'll just make a note about the USDA. While they're a fantastic organization for many reasons, like many of our other governmental agencies like the EPA or the CDC, the EPA kind of has a foot in helping food industrialization take off, because while they do awesome stuff with promoting nutritional education and research and all that fun stuff. They do promote U.S. agricultural products, which and they help push us towards these sorts of systems. So they're not really, exactly innocent on this front, even though they probably should be. But I digress. Now, as we mentioned, we need a lot of water to produce 1 kilogram of grain, right? 1,000 kilograms for 1 grain of water, or 1 kilogram of water. One 1 kilogram of grain. There we go. And so when we're thinking about what the industrialized agricultural system has done, worldwide agriculture accounts for about 70% of total water use and 93% of water depletion. So I think the water use kind of makes sense, right? We only drink 30% of the fresh water that's consumed every year. The rest of it goes to our food. But in terms of water depletion, 93%. And you can really see this in effect here in the United States. The Mississippi River is at its lowest levels it has ever been. And why is that? Well, because farms that are around the Mississippi River are taking and taking and taking unsustainably water from the river, which leads to water depletion. So it's kind of a, again, a function of this industrialized agriculture. And I want to just make mention of it is for those of you that live in Massachusetts and elsewhere too, but this is a picture from a town nearby me. You see these all over the place, right? Water restrictions or water bans are in place, right? And this ties directly into the industrialized sort of way we approach agriculture. Places that are heavily agricultural, even Massachusetts, we still grow a lot of food here. We put a huge tax on our water, and that tax on our water, in terms of like taking it out, not like a monetary tax, um, uh, leads to bans like this. Right? It leads to droughts in Massachusetts, right? It leads to droughts along the Mississippi River. It leads to droughts on the Colorado River, right? So they are tied, right? So how much agriculture takes, again, this industrialized agriculture does directly impact you as well. When you turn on your faucet. Now, in terms of what feeds back in to these water systems is obviously rain, right? Precipitation is the only way you replenish natural sources of water, right? And rainfall varies, right? There's no rainfall, very little rainfall in large parts of the planet, or lots of rainfall, right? So it just kind of varies. But rainfall is what really changes, right? And its variability on a year-to-year basis. But remember, climate change is also projected to decrease overall um, rain levels. So if you're already taking a lot from our reservoirs and aquifers to fuel the industrial agricultural system, well, what happens when this system of rain starts to go bye-bye? Right? We start to lose rain inputs. We have less overall fresh water. So just something to sort of think about. So again, when we're thinking about water, about 2/3 of water use worldwide, as I mentioned, is devoted directly to irrigating crops, right? So just watering them. And worldwide, aquifers are being depleted for the irrigation faster than they can be replenished. So the example I have here, and you can see it here as well, is the Agala aquifer in the northern plain of China. So it's a really great example there. They've almost completely depleted that aquifer. But you can see that elsewhere, right? You can look at here in Massachusetts. We have the Quabbin Reservoir. It's at its lowest historical levels. The Mississippi River, lowest historical levels. So it's not just places like China that are doing it. It's really everywhere that is depleting aquifers for irrigation. So that's water. Next up is our friend pesticides, fertilizers, and pollution. So this is what we dump on fields to help our crops grow faster and larger to produce more yield. This is also what we dump on our fields to make sure our crops don't get out competed by weeds or eaten by insects, right? So helping things grow faster. So about 27 million metric tons of chemical fertilizer were used worldwide in 1960. By 2020, so as of last year, uh, one half of the nitrogen applied to the farmland. The rest of it just gets washed out. Right? It just gets when the rain happens, that fertilizer leaves the fields, goes into our rivers, streams, things like that. So that's fertilizers. Now pesticides, they're a whole nother batch. Now to manufacture pesticides, we use over 1,600 chemicals at the moment to manufacture pesticides. Uh, as you would imagine, most of these chemicals have not been tested for safety. But globally, we apply about 6 million metric tons of pesticides per year. And where we apply pesticides does vary. So some places like the United States rely heavily on pesticides. However, places like Europe, they rely less heavily on pesticides. So it just kind of depends. So in the United States, actually, as you can see from here, we actually apply about 20% of the world's pesticides. And just to sort of show you what sort of effects it's having over time, so we can look at glyphosate resistance weed species in different states. And so this is in 2000. So we're looking at fertilizers like Roundup. You might have heard of Roundup at some point, or you might have seen it at Home Depot or something like that. It's a really really effective pesticide. But so one of the things that comes with use of pesticides is plants becoming resistant to those pesticides. And so you can see in 2000 when Roundup was introduced, there's only two places, I should say, Delaware and California, where there was weed species resistant to Roundup. Well, fast forward to 2009, so just 9 years after the introduction to Roundup, we're seeing that some places have um, upwards of six species of weeds resistant to Roundup, and it's spread to over a dozen states, including most parts of the Midwest, where we grow lots and lots of our food, including our friends here in Iowa, right, where they were depleting their soil at a unsustainable rate. So the use of pesticides clearly bad, right? They're toxic. We don't know quite the effects of pesticides, but um, again, all because you're trying to decrease the amount of um, of pests, increase your outputs, right? This industrialized agriculture. Next up is energy use. So energy usage is pretty high in the agricultural system. So this has a climate change impact on it too. But to give you some numbers, the average United States farm uses about 3 kilocalories, and so a kilocalorie is when you look on the back of your food and it says a calorie. Oh, this can of soda has 120 calories. That's a kilocalorie. Um, and so the average US farm uses 3 kilocalories of fossil energy to produce 1 kilocalorie of food. So that's not a lot. That's grain. Now, when we look at cattle, fossil fuel input is 35 kilocalories for the production of 1 kilocalorie of beef protein. So not a great return here. Not a great return at all. The agricultural sector is pretty heavily intensive, right? It's one of the top sources of greenhouse gases, not just because of the methane, but because it's really heavy on energy usage. And so when we look at numbers, in 2019 alone, the US food system accounted for about 20% of the nation's energy budget. So processing and handling of foods, 20% of the energy budgets, which is a lot. When we look between 1997 and 2002, over 80% of the increase in the annual US energy consumption was related to food in some shape. And remember, the other thing that comes with food is storing food, right? Air conditioning, refrigeration, things like that. Very, very energy intensive. And again, food directly ties to climate change. And so we can look at things that are healthy for you, like cereals and fruits and vegetables. They account for only about 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions from US food choices. But you can see things that are bad for you or things that are not so good for the environment, such as animal protein, oils, snacks, and dairy. They account for the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions. So cows clearly accounting for a huge portion of it. But again, there is other parts of our agricultural system that are impacting our climate as a whole, right? It's not just our cows. There is, there is energy, there is greenhouse gases produced from things too. But again, even other, either bad or not so good choices do have an impact on our climate. So Now, uh, sort of one of the last things the industrial agricultural system does is hitting biodiversity loss. And so we've discussed this idea of biodiversity loss. We talked about this idea of background extinction, right? There's always this background extinction, right? Where species are naturally going extinct. And that background extinction rate is about 1 to 2 species per year. That's pretty low, right? That's relative to the million I'm sorry, that's relative to 1.2 million species we currently have identified on this planet. So 1 to 2 species a year isn't a lot. But when we're looking at the current rate of species loss, it's about 1,000 species per year. And to put that in perspective, the last time we saw an extinction rate that high was when the dinosaurs went bye-bye about 65 million years ago. So really heavy and fast levels of species extinction. And our agricultural system does play a role. And so, how does it play a role? Well, we degrade habitats with the pollution as we input nitrogen, as we input fertilizers, we degrade habitats. So, even if you only ate a plant based diet and you don't do it like, even if it's organic food, you're still putting all sorts of things from the farm into natural environments, which destroys biodiversity. We know that it contributes to climate change, and as we discussed, climate change is impacted or expected to impact biodiversity significantly negatively. We know that overfishing, or tragedy of the commons situation, can impact biodiversity, and then changing land use. And that's the big one, right? Land use change is a huge push on biodiversity loss, and we can look at that. Right? We've looked at something similar to this before, but we can look at cattle ranches account for about 60% of land use changes, agriculture for 30%, and then other commercial things, logging, agriculture, fires, things like that. So land use change, a lot of times do with farming, big effect on biodiversity. Because you can imagine converting a nice patch of the Amazon rainforest into a place where you grow cattle, well, you're going to lose a lot of species there. And again, remember, biodiversity, our friend, feeds directly into those ecosystem services. And I just want to make mention of one thing before we move on is, remember, one of the ecosystem services that agricultural fields heavily rely on is pollination. So as you reduce biodiversity of pollinators, that will directly impact the sustainability of a farm. Right? If you don't have pollinators to pollinate your crops, well, you're kind of crap out of luck, right? So I just wanted to, you know, just to bring that up because it's an important one to sort of think about. Now, one of the other things about our industrial agricultural system is monocropping. And so the most common thing people do is we grow only one type of food in a given field. So we'll only just grow corn here, or we'll only grow soybeans. We'll only grow one thing. And that's a bad thing. If you're only growing one thing, or you're only growing one variety of any given plant, whether it's a cereal or a vegetable, this reduces plant biodiversity and biodiversity in the agricultural ecosystem. And when you do that, when you're only growing one type of corn or you're only growing one type of soybean, this leads them to become more susceptible to pests. It was grown as a monocrop. Now, from what I've been told, it used to be very sweet, not anything like the bananas that we eat now. Very sweet, very flavorful. Now, what ends up happening with that monocrop of bananas, it got hit with a pathogenic fungus called Fusarium. And because it was grown in a monocrop, anytime a grove of bananas would get infected, it would wipe out the entire grove. So again, growing one variety of bananas was not good. It led to the wiping out of a potentially very delicious type of banana, which is why we have the kind of banana we have now, because it was resistant to that fungus and it tastes kind of bland. Sorry if you guys like bananas, but I think bananas don't taste that great by themselves. But that's just me. Um, and actually, for those of you that do like bananas, they're actually seeing a resurgence of that fungus against our current crop of bananas. So bananas, as you know it, are going to change within the next 15 to 20 years, which is not fun. So monocropping is not good. Now, monocropping, again, you're using one variety of something. and whether it's one variety of plant or one variety of animal. And that's a genetic diversity thing, right? If you're only using one variety, you're limiting genetic diversity in your livestock or your plants. And that's not a good thing. Genetic diversity is good, right? It's one component of biodiversity. Remember, biodiversity is really good. Low diversity means pests are more likely to, to crop up, means more likely disease is to emerge, and all these things. So biodiversity in the agricultural system is a good thing. Monocropping is a bad thing. Now, we've been talking mostly about crops at this point. Let's switch gears a bit and talk about the industrialized livestock agricultural sector. About 132 of the Earth's surface is suitable for food production, and so the rest of the place where we're growing food on, it's devoted to growing animals. And as we've discussed, production of meat is a really bad and inefficient use of resources, soil, land, water, grain, things like that. And we can look at numbers. 70% of all agricultural land is for meat production. It's about 30% of the land surface, the entire planet. 40% of the world's grain is grown for livestock, and about 7% of global water use is used to feed grain for livestock. Now, that also brings up this idea of herbicide and insecticide use. 70% of herbicides and 37% of insecticides are in the United States are attributed to growing food for livestock. So while, the way we grow food is not the best, the way we grow livestock is also not the best. I'm actually going to skip these two slides because I don't want to talk about those things. Now, very much like the way we grow vegetables and all this stuff, there is an industrialization of animal production. And when I look at pictures like this, it really it looks awful, right? Right. This, you have 250-pound pigs, dozens of them living in a tiny, tiny place. They can barely move. So, industrialized crop production doesn't look like terrible like this, but this does kind of look awful, right? And so there are ethical concerns here that is clearly an issue, but we're going to focus mostly on uh, you know the effects of biology here, right? Not so much the how sad it is that all these pigs are locked in a cage, but what industrial food production has done. And if you have a couple times, I would Google a little bit of time. Google what Purdue chicken, the chicken farmers, how what their business model is and how they treat the people they contract out to. It's a um, really sad story. So if you want to get like an actual like dose of what's going on here, look up Purdue, the chicken people, and you'll see what their vertical integration looks like. It's a really, really, really crappy system. But industrialized food production, in terms of animals, has pretty heavily vertical integration. One corporation controls essentially every aspect of production and processing, i.e., like a Purdue. Animals are grown in confined animal feeding operations or CAFOs, and these are contracted out to local farmers. So I could own one if I wanted to. Not that I would, but I could, or you guys could. And the animals are fed, and the conditions are strictly controlled by the corporation, not by the farmer. And ultimately, the companies like Purdue sign contracts with the growers, the small scale farmers that often constrict their rights. They make them buy like specific types of feed. Sometimes they give them inferior chickens or cows to hamper their production, like retaliatorily. It's a mess. And ultimately, who's responsible if there's a loss or a disease? It's the growers. It's not the corporations. So this is what vertical integration looks like, right? This is a nice big fat injection of capitalism into a thing, right? This is awful, right? This is just about maximizing profits. So how big is this idea of industrial agriculture in the United States? Well, livestock outnumber humans 5 to 1 in the United States. That means for every person, there is 5 tons of animal waste per year per person. That's a lot of poop. That's a lot of pee. Uh, just for, in terms of numbers, in 2018, 10 billion animals in the United States were slaughtered for food, with 50 billion worldwide, which is a lot, right? So that means 20% of all slaughtered animals were slaughtered in the United States. So that's a big deal here. Now, in the United States, there's currently about 35 million cattle. The statistic that always surprises me is 100 million hogs, and then about 1 million or so broiler chickens and turkey are killed each hour. So you're talking huge numbers of chickens and turkeys killed every year. So it's a lot, right? That's a lot of beef. But remember, behind all that animal protein that you make is a huge investment of water and a huge investment of food, right? And energy, right? There's no, every time you kill a cow for its food, right, you have to refrigerate the meat, which puts a tax on our climate. Now, there's all sorts of issues with public health and food production. So when we're talking about this, industrialized animal, you know, system, it's concentrated, it's high speed meat production, leads to greater risk of foodborne pathogens. Some of them are newly emerging, right? So when you hear about, um, the spreading of swine flu or the spreading of one of the avian flus, right? That's because of our industrial, growing of livestock. We'll talk about this one next slide, but in excessive antibiotic use in animal agriculture does create resistant strains of microbes that we do see pop up in hospital settings. Um, we also are seeing, because we use lots of fertilizers and pesticides, lots of organic pollutants are entering the food chain and entering our own water systems and things like that. And when we're thinking about the economic impacts, when you have one of these industrialized factories where you grow chickens, they don't usually involve local communities. They usually kind of keep them out. And that's obviously not great for local expansion of economies and things like that. And there's also these CAFOs. They have lots of health threat and lots of sort of dangerous conditions, and so they're not this. This is not a sustainable and healthy system by any stretch of the imagination, um, because it's just really not, right. That none of what I've showed you or what I said sounds great. Now, one of the things I want to just to point out is about antibiotic resistance, and you guys know I'm a microbiologist, so of course I was going to point this one out. So there's this weird phenomena in agriculture where if you feed cows and chickens and pigs antibiotics for no reason, just not even because they have infections, they grow faster and they grow larger. They don't know why, but it stimulates them to grow faster. My guess is it has something to do with their microbiome in their gut, but there's not a lot of evidence for that. Now, what this causes is, as that we use more and more antibiotics to grow larger cows and to grow them faster, it leads to more antibiotic resistant bacteria. And so we can look at this total antibiotic use, as we increase, and then we can look at the number of penicillin resistance, so antibiotic resistant Staphylococcus pneumoniae. So staph pneumoniae is one of the causative agents of pneumonia. It's not the only one, but it's one of them. And you'll notice that, in Denmark, all the way up to France and United States and Portugal, right? As you increase antibiotic use, you increase the prevalence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So again, your food is directly tied to the healthcare system, right? More antibiotic-resistant bacteria means more dangerous hospitals, right? So not ideal. But again, all in about 40% of emissions of our methane, 65% of our emissions of nitrous oxide. So climate change, agriculture, tied hand in hand here. And we can just physically look. So we can look at projected changes in agricultural productivity due to climate change. Because remember, as the planet gets warmer, growing, biodiversity is going to go down. Growing food is going to be harder when things are warmer. And so we can look at loss of food production in red and an increase in food production in green. You can see most of the world outside of Europe and most of Asia and northern regions will experience a decrease in food production due to climate change. And this is particularly pronounced in places where there's a lot of people, Southeast Asia and Africa, places that are expected to grow exponentially over time. So climate change again, it's a sleeping giant, right? It's not the thing that's 50 years off, right? It's happening now, but again, it's going to project to get worse and worse and worse. And it is certainly going to impact our capacity to grow food. But there's this new phenomenon that we're observing that is actually going to affect the nutritional value of your food. So if you want to read about this, I linked an article down here from Harvard School of Public Health. And climate change, i.e., more CO2 and warmer temperature, is directly disrupting plant biology, which is leading to plants that are losing zinc, protein, and iron. And so our friend, well, my friend Seth Meyers from the Harvard School of Public Health says our research makes it clear that decisions we are making every day, how we eat, how we heat our homes, what we eat, how we move around, what we choose to purchase, are making our food less nutritious and imperiling the health of other populations and future generations. Now, let's put this in perspective. Now, if future climate change scenario, we're losing protein and zinc and iron in the United States where we eat too much, that's not a big deal, right? We're already eating too much here. Thus, losing a little bit of value is not a big deal. But where this becomes a big deal is when we start to look at places that are already malnourished, right? Southeast Asia and Africa. If they're already malnourished, making their food less healthy for them is likely going to exacerbate their malnutrition problem. So again, climate change is that sleeping giant, and it certainly affects every aspect of your life, and food is also included here. So where do we go? We talked about all these, industrialized way we grow food, right? And we talked about the effects of climate change and all these, relatively negative things about the way we grow food, right? I haven't said a lot of good things, right? I mean, I don't know. I think most classes I don't say a lot of good things, but what can we do about it? Well, the reality is the future is moving away from industrialized agriculture, right? Moving away from this heavily for-profit system, right? Moving away from that tragedy of the common situation where we're maximizing short-term profits at the expense of long-term sustainability. And the best way to do this is actually just to go small. Smallholder farming is more economically and environmentally um, viable. And we know that when we analyze, the economics of this, GDP growth when it originates in agriculture is at least twice as effective in reducing poverty as GDP growth due to for from anything outside of agriculture. So empowering small farmers is a great way to help impoverished areas. It really is. Um, and this agriculture can't just be, monocropping, right? It needs to be based on agroecology with a diverse set of crops and livestocks. And this brings me to my favorite phrase from this entire lecture, which is called sustainable intensification. It's pretty good, right? That's a pretty great buzzword for this class. But essentially, intensifying how we sustainably do things, making everything from top to bottom more sustainable. Um, Getting higher yields with fewer resources. And this requires an investment not just by governments, but nonprofits, as well as the private sector, making technology be available and free. So getting away from the Monsanto business model where they hoard all the technology and they charge farmers exorbitant amounts and they sue them when they use their technology without licensing it. Moving away from that and moving towards this idea of this apparently radical idea of using best practices and using science to inform how you're going to grow crops, right? That's the best way, right? We've been studying the agro ecosystem for decades now. We know a lot about it. Let's use science to make small farming easier, better, and more productive. And then finally, the one thing you can do really effectively is invest in women farmers. Farming is heavily male dominated. It's like 94% or something like that are male farmers. But we do know that women, if you empower women, whether it's in one sector of the economy or the other, it has pretty far-reaching effects on the rest of the economy as well. So that's a great way to not only economically empower a group of people, but to economically empower a whole region of a country or an entire part of the economy. So definitely got to support our ladies here. But then definitely moving towards this more sustainable intensification, doing things the way we've been discussing them in this class. But the big one, as I'm sure you guys can imagine, is less so, I mean, moving away from the industrial agriculture is definitely a big thing. But even if we move away from the industrial agriculture, we're not going to solve our problems unless we change our diets. All right. If we don't change the way how much meat we eat and eat more grains and fruits and vegetables, these problems are still going to persist because of the huge amounts of investment of grain and water to grow a single cow. So that's reality, right? Changing diets, being more plant based. And I say plant based as in like, eating more fruits and vegetables, you know, moving away from, you know, this meat heavy world, right? But the other thing we could do is improve infrastructure. So make the access to markets and storage and refrigeration and surplus better, so we can keep fruits and vegetables fresher longer, right? So more people can access them, so that they're cheaper, and make things more sustainably produced, so that it's ultimately easier to get a hold of, because that's kind of a hard thing, right? It really is, right? It's kind of a hard thing to make available, right? If you have a fresh piece of fresh fruit or vegetable, right, and you're in Africa, well, that's only going to last a little bit when it's 100 degrees out. But if you can improve that infrastructure, improve transportation, improve refrigeration, you can make it more widely available. And I think the big one, from a climate change perspective, is thinking resilience. And resilience, is defined, as the power or the capacity to return to your original form after being bent, compressed, or stretched. And what does that mean in a climate sense? Well, if you hit with a massive drought, how fast can you recover? That's what we're thinking about. Can we make the agricultural ecosystem resilient? Can it recover after a major drought? Can it recover after a major event? Or can it just recover because of how terribly we've treated our soils? Right? That's one of the big things, especially with respect to climate change, making our things more resistant. And so, just as a final note, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the way the United States grows food. And we do things a little bit uniquely here, but we heavily subsidize our food here in the United States. Everywhere does it, but we heavily do it. And when we look at how it's subsidized, most of our subsidies go to meat and dairy, grains, then grains, then sugars, oils, and starches, and alcohols, then nuts and legumes, and then a very small proportion goes to fruits and vegetables. So we heavily subsidize our agriculture. And the reality is, most agriculture isn't actually financially feasible without federal subsidies. And what does that mean? Well, people are selling things. So, i.e., I'm trying to sell, say, a piece of meat, and I can only sell it for so much because that's what the market dictates. But that's not paying for my upfront costs, right? My rent, my energy, right? My food for my animals, right? So that difference is made up by federal subsidies. And as you can see, they're clearly not evenly distributed. But federal subsidies cause many crops to be sold below the production cost because of those subsidies. So it artificially keeps profits essentially down, right? The cost of things down. But what it ultimately does, because certain things are more heavily subsidized, it creates this weird thing, right? Where what's subsidized isn't the most heavily recommended foods to eat, right? Protein is important, but it's not the most, it's the most heavily subsidized thing. It should only make up a small proportion of your overall nutritional things, with grains and fruits and vegetables, which gets the smallest amount of federal subsidies, um, being the most part of your diet, right? So there's this inequality. The government subsidizes only a small proportion of what you should be eating. And so when you ask the question, why does a salad cost more than a Big Mac? It's because of those federal food subsidies, right? What's in the farm bill. The farm bill is unequally targeted, where it leads to things that aren't good for you being subsidized more than things that are good for you. And so that's why your Big Mac costs less than a salad. However, that's like, kind of like a conundrum, right? But it does propose this, really dire issue of nutritional inequality, right? Where if you can't afford a salad, well, what are you forced to eat? Well, you're forced to eat something unhealthy that's been heavily subsidized, like a Big Mac, right? Because you can go to any fast food chain right now and you can get a burger for $1, right? I mean, they're delicious, but they're terrible for you, right? And why can you get that burger for $1? That's because of this. And so if you're economically not doing so well, well, you can only afford things that are heavily subsidized, like burgers from McDonald's. which means you're going to eat less nutritious food, and you're going to have this essentially a it's going to exacerbate the malnutrition problem that's already present in the United States. And it also exacerbates our problem with obesity, right? In the United States, unlike places like Africa, you can have very poor people that are very obese. And why is that? Well, because it's cheaper to go to the store, buy a Big Mac and eat that than it is to buy a nice salad, right? And that's because of our federal food subsidies. So food subsidies are important, but the way the food subsidies are put out is not equal and not the way they really should be. So that's going to do it. So I'm going to stop recording.